Death row isn't what you think. The truth movies never show. Death row doesn't begin with an execution. It begins with a door that closes and never opens again. No countdown, no certainty, just years of waiting while the outside world keeps moving and you don't. This isn't a story about how people die on death row. It's about what happens long before that, when the mind realizes time has stopped working. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in a responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd really love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it too. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to life. When someone is sentenced to death, most people imagine a straight line from verdict to execution. But the modern death penalty doesn't work that way. In reality, death row is a place of indefinite suspension, a psychological space where punishment is not defined by violence, but by duration, isolation, and uncertainty. This documentary examines what life actually becomes after a death sentence is handed down, not through rumor or myth, but through verified research, documented inmate behavior, and first-hand accounts analyzed by psychologists who have spent decades inside the system. The question isn't whether death row is harsh. The question is whether the waiting itself becomes the real sentence. When time stops having meaning. The first thing death row takes is not freedom. It takes predictability. According to data from the National Institute of Justice and State Correctional Records, individuals sentenced to death often wait 15 to 25 years, sometimes longer, before their sentence is resolved. During that time, daily life becomes radically compressed. Cells are small. Movement is limited. Days are structured down to the minute. But psychologically, something more damaging begins to happen. Researchers like Craig Haney have documented how prolonged confinement under death sentence conditions produces temporal distortion, a breakdown in how the brain experiences time. Inmates describe days that feel endless, followed by years that seem to disappear without memory. One former death row inmate interviewed in post-exoneration studies described the experience this way. After the first few years, he stopped marking time by seasons or birthdays. Instead, time was measured by court filings, appeals, and the rare sound of another cell door opening. This is where death row separates itself from other forms of incarceration. Unlike life sentences, death row offers no stable future to mentally adapt to. Unlike short sentences, there is no end point to orient toward. Psychologists refer to this condition as chronic anticipatory stress, a state in which the body remains permanently braced for an event that never arrives. Over time, this stress reshapes cognition itself. In studies reviewed by the American Psychological Association, inmates in prolonged isolation report difficulty recalling recent event, emotional flattening, a gradual loss of internal motivation, and most notably, a shrinking sense of self. This is not sudden madness. It is slow psychological erosion. By the time many inmates reach their 10th year on death row, their greatest fear is no longer execution. It is the realization that their internal life has already begun to disappear. Isolation without silence. Death row is often described as quiet. But for the people inside it, quiet is not the absence of sound. It's the absence of response. Most death row units operate under conditions of near total isolation. Contact is limited, movement is restricted, and social interaction is controlled to the point of scarcity. According to correctional policy reviews and observational studies cited by the NIJ and CDCR, many inmates spend 22 to 23 hours a day alone. Psychologically, the human brain does not register isolation as neutral. John Irwin's prison sociology research shows that identity is maintained through interaction, being seen, being acknowledged, being reacted to. When those feedback loops are removed, the mind begins to turn inward in unstable ways. At first, inmates attempt to simulate connection. They talk to themselves. They replay conversations from memory. They assign personalities to routine sounds, footsteps, keys, distant doors. Over time, these coping mechanisms stop working. Clinical observations referenced by the American Psychological Association describe a progression: emotional blunting followed by hypersensitivity. Small disruptions, a light flicking on, a guard's voice, a schedule change, begin to trigger outsized stress responses. One former death row inmate, later released after a sentence reversal, described how isolation altered his behavior in ways he didn't recognize until years later. He became increasingly detached during legal visits, not because he didn't care, but because sustained conversation felt exhausting. His mind had adapted to minimal stimulation, and human presence became overwhelming. This is not a failure of character. It is adaptation. Craig Haney's analysis of long-term solitary confinement explains this as psychological narrowing. When external input disappears, the brain reduces its range of emotional and cognitive expression to survive. The result is a person who appears calm on the surface, but internally fragile. Importantly, this state does not reverse quickly. Even inmates removed from death row, through resentencing or exoneration, often struggle to reintegrate into normal social environments. Noise feels invasive. Choices feel paralyzing. Trust becomes abstract. Death row, in this sense, extends beyond the cell. It follows the person outward. And this raises a question the system rarely addresses. If punishment is meant to end at the sentence, what does it mean when its effects do not? The erosion of identity. After years on death row, many inmates stop thinking of themselves as people moving through life. They begin to think of themselves as cases. Case numbers, appeal statuses, filing dates. According to research reviewed by the National Institute of Justice and Sociological Analyses by John Irwin, death row inmates gradually experience what is known as identity displacement, a condition where personal identity is overshadowed by institutional labeling. This doesn't happen overnight. At first, inmates cling to markers of who they were before incarceration: family roles, past skills, personal beliefs. But death row offers almost no opportunity to express or reinforce these identities. There is no meaningful work, no social role, no forward trajectory. Over time, the brain adapts by simplifying the self. Instead of "I am a father" or "I am a brother," identity becomes reduced to "I am condemned" or "I am waiting." Psychologists note that this shift is especially pronounced on death row because the sentence carries a symbolic finality, even though execution may be decades away. Craig Haney's interviews with death sentence individuals reveal a recurring pattern. Inmates begin speaking about themselves in the third person during legal discussions, as if the case and the self are no longer fully connected. This detachment serves a purpose. By distancing themselves from their own identity, inmates reduce emotional exposure to uncertainty and loss. But the cost of this coping mechanism is profound. Emotional investment fades. Long-term thinking collapses. Moral reflection becomes abstract rather than personal. One documented case examined by the Chicago Crime Lab involved an inmate who stopped participating in his own appeals process. Not because he wanted to die, but because the ongoing legal uncertainty had stripped the process of meaning. Hope, in this context, had become psychologically expensive. This is a critical point, often misunderstood. Loss of engagement does not equal acceptance of death. It reflects psychological exhaustion. APA-reviewed studies show that prolonged identity erosion is linked to depression-like states marked not by sadness, but by emotional emptiness. Inmates describe feeling thin, distant, or already gone, even while physically alive. Death row, in this sense, creates a condition where a person continues existing biologically, while their sense of self gradually recedes. The system records this as compliance. Clinicians recognize it as damage. And this damage accumulates quietly, without visible crisis, making it easy to overlook until something breaks. When hope becomes a threat, hope is usually treated as a psychological anchor. On death row, it can become a liability. Legal appeals move slowly and unpredictably. Some advance, some stall, some reverse without warning. According to analyses reviewed by the National Institute of Justice and court tracking data examined by the Chicago Crime Lab, inmates often experience long periods where nothing changes, followed by sudden legal movement that radically alters their future. This instability creates a paradox. Hope requires emotional investment, but emotional investment on death row carries risk. Craig Haney's work documents how many inmates begin to manage hope strategically. Instead of hoping for release, they limit expectation altogether. Not because they've given up, but because disappointment, repeated over years, becomes psychologically destabilizing. In this context, emotional restraint is survival. Some inmates deliberately avoid reading legal updates. Others stop discussing appeals with family members. A few instruct attorneys not to contact them unless something changes significantly. These behaviors are often misinterpreted as indifference. Clinically, they reflect protective withdrawal. The American Psychological Association notes that prolonged exposure to uncontrollable outcomes can lead to what is called anticipatory shutdown, a state where the mind reduces emotional responsiveness to avoid repeated stress spikes. One nonfiction case examined in correctional psychology literature involved an inmate whose sentence was unexpectedly reduced after nearly 2 decades on death row. Instead of relief, he experienced panic. The possibility of release required him to imagine a future he had mentally trained himself not to envision. Freedom, in this moment, felt unsafe. This reaction challenges common assumptions. Death row does not simply punish by threatening death. It reshapes the emotional economy of the person living under the sentence. Hope becomes dangerous. Certainty, even if grim, becomes stabilizing. This is why some inmates report greater distress during appeal periods than during years of inactivity. Movement reintroduces uncertainty. Uncertainty reactivates emotional systems that have been deliberately muted. The system records this as resilience. Psychology identifies it as adaptation under constraint. And once adaptation takes hold, reversing it becomes difficult, sometimes impossible. Morality under permanent judgment. On death row, morality is no longer shaped by society. It is shaped by constant judgment without resolution. Every person sentenced to death lives under an official declaration that their life has been deemed forfeit. That declaration doesn't just define their legal status. It reshapes how moral responsibility is processed internally. According to research cited by the National Institute of Justice and Analyses by Craig Haney, death row inmates often experience a shift in moral reasoning over time, not toward cruelty or chaos, but toward moral detachment. When consequences no longer include a future, decision-making changes. Small choices, what to read, what to say in letters, whether to engage with others, take on disproportionate weight, while larger moral frameworks begin to fade. Concepts like redemption, improvement, or restitution lose practical relevance in an environment that does not recognize moral change. John Irwin's prison ethnography highlights this contradiction clearly. Institutions often demand behavioral compliance from death row inmates, while simultaneously denying them any moral pathway forward. Good behavior does not alter the sentence. Growth does not restore possibility. This creates what psychologists describe as moral stagnation. One documented case analyzed in post-conviction behavioral studies involved an inmate who became meticulously rule-abiding over decades. Not because he believed in the institution, but because rule-following offered the only remaining sense of agency. Morality narrowed into routine. For others, the response was different. Some inmates disengaged entirely from moral evaluation. They stopped measuring actions as right or wrong and instead evaluated them based on emotional cost. If an interaction required vulnerability, it was avoided. If a choice risked disappointment, it was declined. This is not antisocial behavior. It is defensive moral minimalism. The American Psychological Association notes that prolonged exposure to environments where moral effort yields no outcome often leads to ethical flattening, a state where individuals conserve moral energy because it produces no external effect. Importantly, this process does not indicate a lack of conscience. It reflects a system that offers judgment without dialogue, condemnation without conclusion. On death row, morality does not disappear. It contracts. And when it contracts far enough, the individual begins living in a narrowed ethical space where survival, not meaning, becomes the dominant concern. The aftermath. Life after death row. For most people, life after incarceration is a chance to rebuild. For death row inmates, the situation is far more complex. Whether an inmate is exonerated, resentenced, or in rare cases, executed and replaced by survival, the psychological aftermath is profound and often unexpected. Time suspended has consequences. Years of anticipation, chronic stress, identity narrowing, and moral contraction leave mental and emotional scars that do not dissolve simply because the physical constraint ends. Studies by the American Psychological Association, as well as longitudinal research from the Chicago Crime Lab, demonstrate that former death row inmates face challenges in cognitive functioning, emotional regulation, and social reintegration that are distinct from other formerly incarcerated populations. The disorienting transition. The first challenge is temporal disorientation. During death row confinement, individuals experience a distortion in how they perceive the passage of time, a phenomenon described in Craig Haney's seminal research on long-term solitary and death sentence confinement. Years may pass in a near blink, punctuated only by appeals, attorney visits, or rare external contact. After release, even when legally free, the world moves at a pace that can feel alien. Newspapers, technology, cultural trends, and even family dynamics evolve far beyond the mental scaffolding the inmate has maintained. One exonerated inmate, released after 18 years on death row, described the first few weeks outside prison as like waking from a dream where the world had rewritten itself without permission. The experience was not euphoric. Every simple task, crossing a street, speaking to strangers, navigating public transportation, was overwhelming because the brain had been trained to operate in a predictably confined, controlled environment for decades. Cognitive and emotional challenges. Prolonged anticipation of death has a unique cognitive signature. Studies cited by the National Institute of Justice and corroborated by CDCR research indicate that chronic anticipatory stress alters the prefrontal cortex and amygdala connectivity, affecting executive function, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Individuals emerging from death row often report difficulty with planning future actions, sustaining attention, managing social nuance, experiencing joy without guilt or fear. Unlike inmates serving life sentences, who may retain a sense of long-term purpose or gradual adaptation, death row inmates have been conditioned for survival under extreme unpredictability. Upon release, these coping strategies can misfire in free society. Where independence and initiative are required, ex-inmates experience paralysis. Where social engagement is expected, they react with avoidance. One post-release study, conducted by the Chicago Crime Lab and peer-reviewed in the Journal of Criminal Justice, found that over 70% of ex-death row inmates exhibited symptoms consistent with complex PTSD, often exceeding those of the general prison population. Emotional flatness, hypervigilance, and anxiety persisted for years, challenging reintegration efforts. The identity dilemma. The psychological process of identity contraction described in earlier chapters continues after release. Individuals who have defined themselves primarily as a condemned person or a case number struggle to reconstruct a meaningful self-narrative. John Irwin's sociological research notes that many ex-death row inmates experience identity liminality, a state where they are no longer the person the system condemned, but cannot yet inhabit the fully autonomous social roles they once held or imagined. Former inmates described feeling already gone, even when physically present, struggling to reconnect with family or friends who have moved forward in their own lives. Parents find that children are grown, siblings have distant lives, social networks have dissolved. This loss of relational scaffolding intensifies the sense of temporal and moral dislocation. The individual is now tasked with relearning trust, empathy, and social rhythm that were atrophied during confinement. The moral consequences. Death row incarceration reshapes moral reasoning, as discussed previously. Post-release, individuals often find their internal ethical compass misaligned with societal expectations. Former inmates may struggle to interpret consequence and responsibility because, for years, moral and legal feedback loops were decoupled from outcome. The system demanded compliance, but offered no path to moral or social restitution. As a result, reintegration requires more than logistical support. It requires psychological recalibration, often with professional mental health intervention. Programs like those documented in CDCR transitional studies emphasize therapy focused on emotional processing, moral reconciliation, and rebuilding agency. Without such support, ex-inmates may experience persistent guilt, shame, or disconnection, paradoxically, even if legally exonerated or freed. The role of hope and anxiety. Paradoxically, release can reintroduce a form of stress worse than confinement. During incarceration, emotional exposure is carefully moderated. Expectations are low, and the brain's stress system is adapted to predictable unpredictability. Outside, the sudden reintroduction of choice, consequence, and relational dynamics can overwhelm the mind. Craig Haney notes that some ex-inmates fear freedom more than death itself. Not because they wish to remain imprisoned, but because the world now demands engagement on terms they have not practiced in decades. Anxiety manifests in subtle ways, avoiding crowds, withdrawing from social networks, or hesitating to make even basic financial or vocational decisions. This psychological profile underscores why transition programs are critical. Simply releasing an individual does not undo decades of chronic stress, identity contraction, or moral erosion. Reintegration must account for trauma, anticipation-induced cognitive restructuring, and the invisible imprint of time suspended. Case studies. Inmate A, exonerated after 20 years, initially refused to meet family members, stating that their interactions felt too fast, too real, and too unpredictable. With gradual therapy, he slowly rebuilt connections and re-established a daily routine. Inmate B, resentenced from death to life imprisonment, described years of guilt and disorientation, struggling to accept that decisions now had lasting consequences and that society would judge his actions without the constant expectation of death. Inmate C, released after sentence commutation, experienced profound difficulty holding a job due to both emotional hypervigilance and cognitive slowing caused by prolonged anticipatory stress. All cases highlight that death row's impact does not end at the door. It follows the individual outward, shaping cognition, emotion, and behavior long after legal freedom. Verified sources supporting Chapter 6. National Institute of Justice, NIJ, longitudinal studies on death row. American Psychological Association, APA, research on prolonged anticipatory stress. Craig Haney, Death by Design and Related Prison Psychology Studies. John Irwin, The Warehouse Prison. Chicago Crime Lab, Post-Incarceration Behavioral Studies. California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, Transitional Programs Data. The Last Truth of Death Row. Death row leaves an imprint that cannot be erased by time, release, or exoneration. For decades, the mind endures extreme uncertainty, isolation, and moral recalibration. Inmates emerge not as they were, but as people reshaped by waiting, anticipation, and psychological endurance. Even freedom cannot erase the invisible chains of decades lived under constant threat. Hope, fear, identity, and morality are altered in ways that most people cannot imagine. The question that remains is not what death row does to bodies. It is what it does to the human spirit. This is the hidden truth the system rarely acknowledges. The punishment extends beyond law, beyond incarceration, beyond execution. It follows the individual long after the door opens. Understanding this reality is not just about empathy. It's about confronting the moral implications of a system that reshapes lives in ways the public rarely sees. If this documentary opened your eyes to the human cost of death row, hit subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the realities hidden inside the justice system. Every view, every share helps bring these stories to light because truth deserves to be seen.